So hello and welcome to the New Gig podcast. I'm your host, Glen Hodgson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by journalist, writer, and founder of the Homeworker magazine, Louise Goss. How are you doing, Louise?
Hi, Glenn. Lovely to be here. I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So let's go back to the beginning. What's the background? Give it a little bit of a context and introduce yourself, basically, to the viewers and listeners.
So I am a journalist, as you mentioned, sort of by trade. That was how I started. They were my first roles, and it started in broadcast. So actually, my background was primarily in radio, a bit of TV, news reading, reporting, doing all that fun stuff. And it was after we sort of very long story cut short, moved to Australia with my now husband.
Yep.
And sort of started our life out there. I ended up working for some of the Australian broadcast networks as well. And then when children came along, as often is the case, I just realized I needed to do something a little bit different. I needed a bit more flexibility. My husband at the time was also working in the forces, so he was moving around quite a lot. So there were quite a few situations, sort of personal circumstances, that just meant I wanted and needed a bit more flexibility. As a slight sort of aside, sort of like moving away from the traditional career path, I ended up working briefly for a fintech, a startup, and helped to get this going over in Australia. But what that ended up doing was kind of opening my eyes up to quite a number of small businesses and entrepreneurs.
Right.
Because they were the people that I was talking to and interviewing at the time. And that got me thinking. And when we got back to the UK, and again, I found myself at this sort of crossroads, two young children, 2 under 3, going back into the newsroom full time just wasn't going to be a practical option for us. So I needed to find something that I could do from home.
Yeah.
And I was quite used to being self-employed. And so that didn't daunt me too much, or being a freelancer. So I started doing a little bit of freelance work, but I had this idea for the Homeworker magazine. As I say, that stemmed from just this realization that there were so many small business owners, micro businesses, entrepreneurs, freelancers out there, just working from home, doing this huge array of quite interesting and very different things. And I started thinking, okay, so how do they make that work? Because, you know, it's very easy to just think of people sitting at their kitchen table working away. But, you know, having done it myself, or having worked from home for well over a decade, I know that that's not just the case. It's not quite as simple as that. So I thought, you know, there wasn't anything out there that I could see that was really looking at this group of people, and quite a large group of the working population. And so this idea for the Homeworker started, you know, there was the seeds were sown. And when, as I say, when we got back to the UK, I began working on that, and this idea for the magazine came about. And there we go. And pre-pandemic, I launched. And then, of course, 2020 happened. Who was
So necessity is the mother of invention for all these things. But of course, then the whole process was turbocharged by the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, what you were saying is something being quite niche and a little bit fringe suddenly became mainstream for the majority of the population.
Yes, absolutely. So when I first launched, it was really, I suppose, looking at the freelancer, that's sort of the self-employed person, because they were predominantly the people who were home-based, working at home. And now, of course, that's much wider. And that's not to say that there weren't people remote working prior to that. But of course, now the audience is much bigger, and a lot of the content, I suppose, that I create and the people that I speak to, it's applicable to anybody who not just even works from home necessarily, but just doesn't always work in the office. And I think there is a difference there between working from home and working remotely. I think now the conversation is turning more towards working from anywhere. And the fact that, you know, we have the ability, a lot of us have the ability to do that if we're not constrained to the office.
Yeah, absolutely. There's more flexibility, more choice, and how, when, and where you work is much more open than it ever was before, thanks to technology and the developments in mindset as well. I think is equally important, that you can be working remotely and actually working, as opposed to skiving off or something like that.
Well, that's it. So there was always this stigma, and it still exists in some cases. You see a lot of
Right.
resistance to it from some companies in particular. But when I with the home worker, I was always about supporting the people who do it, and it was never. I was always say it's never prescriptive. It's suggestive. I talk to experts. I interview lots of people in different areas, and offer up ways that people can do this and thrive while they're doing it. Because working at home or not working in an office, it does come with challenges. It's not always the easiest thing. I always say, when people think about just pulling up a chair at the table and hoping they can, get along, like, yes, for a few days and ad hoc, of course you can. But if you're wanting to do it long term, sustainably, successfully, then you do need to look at the work environment that you create for yourself, the mindset that you adopt, the habits and routines and structures that you put in place. So there's all these different things that you need to consider. And that really was also the foundation for the magazine. I was looking at communication, at mindset, at well-being, at your work environment, and the way we communicate as well, because we have to think about not just communicating with colleagues, which obviously does change slightly when you're in a remote scenario,
Absolutely.
but also the people that we live with, because suddenly our homes are also the office, and vice versa, and that comes with its own challenges, and of course how we speak to ourselves as well, because if you are spending a lot of time on your own, I think that the mindset and the self-talk and that sort of thing is really important as well.
And this, I think it's a really interesting thing that more people are getting into this and thinking about it. What, from your perspective, and this goes into sort of the home worker, which covers all these trends. And I think it's a fantastic magazine that covers some really important elements of the kind of the freelance or the remote work lifestyle. What are the kind of the personal hints and tips that you could share as well, Louise, there, basically on your own experience of this work style, lifestyle that we both share?
It is. And it is a lifestyle. I think the whole thing that people talk about now is how blurred those boundaries become. And it's that in itself can be a problem for some people, because, you don't feel like you ever fully switch off. And I think that's one of the most important things to look at when you are working from home. You don't have even the visual cues around you of people closing down, leaving the office, going home. So it's all about creating the right balance for yourself. And with increased flexibility and increased autonomy, then hopefully for most people, and certainly if you are self-employed, you do have a degree of, as I say, flexibility that allows you to work around your life rather than the other way around. And I think that's obviously the ideal scenario, that work doesn't dominate and just become everything that we do, because we want to be able to spend our time doing more of the things that we enjoy, spending it with the people that we want to spend it with, and doing the things that are important to us. And work is a big component of that, but we don't want it to become the be all and end all. So I think it's all about trying to achieve balance. It's about trying to, and I say self-awareness is such a key thing when you work from home. You've got to have a high degree of self-awareness. You've got to understand, when do you work best? What is it that distracts you? When are you going to feel more alert, and when do you feel like you need to have that rest? What kind of work inspires you? What kind of people do you engage with best? What environment around you works for you? What color, even as simple as colors or plants, or things that inspire you, because you've got to put all of that, you've got to think about all of that when you're trying to work well. And so I think, as I say, a high degree of self-awareness is really important, because then you can start to structure your day. It just helps to inform when you might do certain tasks and when you might step away, when you might fit in some exercise. So I think all of
Yes.
these things are really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of discipline and consistency within that as well are crucial things for everyone to be able to take on board. And it's not always obvious. And as you rightly say, it needs to be tailored to the individual, but just to know what's out there and the different ways of doing things, pick and choose and try out, and then find out which bits and pieces work for you in terms of organizing your day and how you work. And I think this the division as well is really important between sort of work and life. And of course, you can overlap. Who doesn't want to sort of go shopping in the middle of the day as opposed to the busiest times when it takes twice as long and stuck in traffic and all these kind of things. But at the same time, sort of be able to sort of compartmentalize to a certain degree.
And that, we talk about flexibility and autonomy and having that freedom to, structure your day. And of course, there are going to be moments when that's not entirely possible. You're going to have set meetings and things that you have to be there but I think we're talking more of a sort of taking that wider view of what you can do generally. Like you have that freedom. And I think that's really important. As I say, it's slowly we're starting to see it perhaps a little bit more with people adopting that hybrid approach. And because more people are working remotely, they do tend to have a higher degree of autonomy over how they spend their time. But of course, you can't have a full day that's entirely your own. For the most part, you've got some commitments there that you have to fulfill, and rightly so. But it's about taking that sort of that overview and saying, actually, overall, I've got a bit more freedom and sort of making that work for you. And I think if we're talking about employees, I think businesses, I think employers are, for the most part, I want to say we're starting to see it a bit more, but are becoming more accommodating and more understanding of sort of personal circumstances and why it's important to let people finish for early at one point so they can go and perhaps do a school pickup, but it might mean that they come back and work a little bit later. It's having that flexibility. And I think it's, as long as the work is done and that things are delivered on time and the right standard, then that's probably where we should be looking at aiming. It's looking at that, again, the outcomes and rather than hours the desk and sort of the more micromanaging, which can be a real
totally agree.
turn off.
Completely. And sort of taking things one step further, I mean, people who want to sort of engage their passion and turn that into a business or a career or a lifestyle, what are the things that you're seeing in terms of the trends and the desire of people in this space?
I think the turning your passion into a job is an interesting one for me. I see a lot more talk now about finding your purpose, and I think that is becoming more important. I think people want to feel like the work that they're doing means something. They want to understand that, because that in itself is motivating.
Yes.
I think sometimes when you don't know exactly what you're working towards, that can cause a bit of disengagement and can people sort of drift off and not have that clarity. And I think that's really important, to have that vision and to understand that purpose, and for, if you're working in an organization, for that to be communicated to you.
Of course.
I think when we talk about passion as well, I think perhaps more importantly, I would say, is to dig into your values, because passions can change, and which is, it's fine. And also, I think sometimes people might think, well, my passion might be, I don't know, dance or something like that. And not realistically, we have to be realistic. Not everybody is going to make a long-term successful career doing that. But if they then perhaps dig more into their values, okay, what's important to me? I need something that allows me to be creative and express myself, so it still fulfills you. But it's just kind of like broadening that scope of like, it's important to do something that you enjoy, but I think it's important to do something that aligns with your values, perhaps sometimes, and that could well be your passion.
Mm.
But I think sometimes when we talk about our passion becoming our work, sometimes that can get a bit confused, or can almost narrow people's minds too much, or think that
Yes.
I have to do this, and that's not going to work for everybody. So I
Mm.
think it's perhaps sometimes more helpful to think about, okay, well, what are my values, and what kind of purpose do I want, and
Mm.
then that allows us to, again, just be a bit more flexible, and think outside the box in terms of what we might want to do as a job.
Absolutely. And what is the role that technology and digitalization having in all this? Because we're seeing
Mm.
almost on a weekly basis new apps, new channels that are opening up.
Yeah.
And for perhaps the first time freelancer or remote worker, it could be a little bit daunting. But just the role that this is playing in the present and also the future of work as well.
Well, I mean, it's having a huge impact, and we've seen that just in the last couple of years, and since COVID as well. And I think it's that the pandemic was probably a real catalyst as well for people developing and
Yeah.
increasing the digitization. Um, there are pros and cons with digitization, but yes, we are going to see it, more automation, and we're seeing that happening. We're seeing that, we have to think in terms of jobs as well. Like, are they sustainable? Are they future-proof jobs, or are they going
Yeah.
to be automated in a couple of years? So
Mm.
that's one thing to think about with the digitization. And I also think, um, for individuals, I mean, it's brilliant because we are able to work again pretty much from anywhere, because we have the technology now that allows us to still communicate. We have all these different platforms, well, just like we are now, we're in
Yeah.
different countries, but we're talking with each
Absolutely.
other. We can see each other. There are lots of sort of collaboration tools as well that you can do remotely and digitally, which is really helpful. So it's allowing people that freedom and that flexibility, and it's allowing people to work with a broader range of people. We're not suddenly restricted to only the people within a few miles radius of us.
Mm.
So there's all of that, which is really good stuff. And I think it's also changing the way that we communicate. Again, we are having to do this virtually, which has pros and cons, but we're having to learn how to interact with people and still engage and still feel get those connections, and perhaps be a little bit more proactive about how we do that, because it's, we're
Yeah.
not just bumping into people spontaneously as perhaps as much as we were. But it also highlights the importance, I think, of soft skills. As things do become increasingly digitized and
Mm.
automated, we can't forget that we're still people, we're still humans. And in the world of business as well, people still want to work with people and have that
Right.
human connection. And I think that increasingly that is going to become really important. It's those, the emotional intelligence, those interpersonal skills, the conversational, the ability to be more creative and think outside the box, and all these sorts of things are going to be, really important moving forwards and going into the future as well.
Absolutely. And I think that this is it. It's a slightly different focus. And as time goes on, we have Chat GPT and developments in AI constantly, but the ability for us to do as humans well what maybe machines can't do so well is probably a good way of
Well, that's
future
it. So,
proofing.
that again, there are things that machines are and robots are going to be much more efficient at, and that's going to start streamlining certain things. But certainly at the moment, they're never going to fully replace you know what humans have in terms of just that emotional connection and that ability to, just those interpersonal skills, and the things that
Mm.
are going to, as I say,
And,
that are increasingly important as well in a remote world, where perhaps you're not feeling like you've got the, quite the same level of human contact. So
yes.
actually, when you do have it, it's really important that you make the most of that, and that you become
Mm.
quite skilled at that.
There's extra value to these things. And would
Yes.
you say that the whole education system, which hasn't really changed a great deal over recent decades, sort of forming the next generation children towards the world of work and the work style of the future. Any changes that will be necessary to be able to facilitate this and fit in with the new reality?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, so I have two young children at the moment, but they're only in primary school, so I haven't had the current experience of what it's like in the secondary schools right now. Obviously, I have
Yeah.
my own experience of it. I do think that there is quite a long way to go in terms of education, in terms of really sort of nurturing sort of entrepreneurial spirits and skills. Um, Generally, when we think of school, it's still very much, they prize the grades, getting the high
Yeah.
grades, and there's a lot of learning by rote and
Yeah.
conforming, and you know there's a lot of benefit to that, and it will suit some people really well.
Mm.
However, you those people who, for the future, where we're going to want people who are really adaptable and creative, and again have that emotional intelligence. I think that's somewhere where, education, the sort of system, needs to sort of start shifting slightly, because people, particularly if we're thinking about sort of the entrepreneurial side of things, they value their independence and
Yeah.
that ability to think outside the box and not conform so much. So I think and the education system doesn't quite serve them in the same way that it does, say somebody else who wants to go down that more traditional route. And it's also just opening people up to what
Yeah.
else is out there as well. Gosh, when I think back, and we are talking a few years ago now, but when I, going to the careers office at school, and there was like an alphabetized filing system of different jobs that you could do, from A for accountant through to, I don't know, down to, can't think of anything beyond the Z, but V for vet, and it was a lot, very traditional careers and things. But
Right.
things really have moved on a lot now, and I think that there are jobs that are going to exist in a few years' time that we don't even know about now. So
100%.
it's more kind of opening people's minds up, and allowing them perhaps to explore and have that independence. And when you think about some of the entrepreneurs or sort of successful people in business now, so there's a man over here, for instance, called Stephen Bartlett. He's one of the Dragon's Den, and he's sort of successful entrepreneur, but I believe he was expelled when he was at school. And you hear about these stories because these people don't generally sort of fit the mold, and I think that's where things can probably change a bit, because we've got to be accepting that there are, it's actually those people who we need to nurture and bring on board, and help encourage them, and that spirit, and not to say bad behavior or anything, but there's just a yeah, I think, I say, just a broadening of sort of minds, and being able to create an environment for those people where they can also thrive as well. And I think that's
Yeah.
sometimes not necessarily prized at school. It's all about getting the A grades,
Mm.
rather than perhaps developing experiences and things.
I absolutely agree. And I think it's sort of making it the one size fits all to be a bit broader and encompass different ways of learning, and different character types and the way people like to take on information. But this openness and ability to learn, and desire to learn, is probably the key role in the education system, that whatever route you want to take, that you feel you're being supported, and you have the possibility and hopefully the tools as well to be
It's
able
seeing
to take this further.
showing them that there's possibilities out there,
Yeah.
and that you're not constrained, and that you're being funneled down one particular route, because again, it doesn't suit everybody. And I'm not criticizing teachers here either, because I think they do an amazing job, and it's
Absolutely, they
really
do.
difficult. And as I say, I've got two who are just in primary school at the moment, so they're still very young, and I see certain things happening even there. There's which is positive. There's a lot more now focus, I think, on sort of the well-being side of things as well,
Yeah.
and the emotional side of stuff. So the mindfulness and that side does seem to be filtering through a bit more.
Mm.
And I know they do tend to do a lot of work again around sort of values and
Mm.
human values and that side of things as well. I think stuff is happening. Obviously in secondary school, I haven't got that experience with having as a parent, but I think these conversations do seem to be happening. It's just
Right.
that perhaps the progress on it is not, and it's not perhaps getting through to everybody or to the people who need it all
Yeah.
the time. So
Yeah.
it's tricky.
It certainly is, but this is something that we'll be revisiting. And of course, in the Homeworker magazine, giving sort of the hints, tips, advice, and viewpoints from different perspectives on this crazy thing that we call the future of work, and the constant changes that are underway at the moment. And really appreciate you sharing your thoughts, ideas, and unique perspective here, Louise.
Thank you. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks indeed.